Hello, everyone. This week in the traditional church calendar, we celebrate All Saints' Day, or All Hallows' Day, which is, of course, where All Hallows' Eve is where we get the term Halloween, which is probably a little more famous. But the traditional reading for All Saints' Day comes from Matthew 5, the beginning of Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, something traditionally called the Beatitudes. And this name, if you're not familiar, comes from the Latin because they say blessed a bunch of times. And the Latin for that is like beatus or something like that. Same kind of root as our beautiful or beatific. And so this section is one that's very famous. It's one that's recognizable to many people, even without much of a religious background. It's kind of like Psalm 23, just one of those kind of beautiful cultural heritage things that people can recognize and say, this is kind of the ideal, the height of good religious teaching. It shows up in a lot of ways culturally. I was listening this morning to a string quartet called the Beatitudes. It's very beautiful, which may surprise some of you that know my taste in music. I do listen to pretty music too. But so I think just in honor of, just the tradition around this, I am going to read the Beatitudes today from the King James itself. So I'm starting at the beginning of Matthew chapter 5. And seeing the multitudes, he went up into a mountain. Where he was seated, his disciples came to him. And he opened his mouth and taught them, saying, Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are they that mourn, for they shall be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Blessed are they who do hunger and thirst after righteousness, for they shall be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the sons of God. Blessed are they who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are ye when men shall revile you and persecute you, and shall say all manner of evil falsely against you, for my sake. Rejoice and be exceedingly glad, for great is your reward in heaven, for so persecuted they the prophets who were before you. So if you know me well, you probably know I'm up to something because I don't read the King James or acknowledge the way our culture likes to read sections of the Bible very often. But I think it's important for this section before I pull the rug out from the way we tend to approach the Beatitudes, because the words are very pretty. The words are very familiar. They're pretty. They, I think, in many people's mind, show up as an ideal of maybe it is like a saint. Saint Francis lived into these, and as much as I love Saint Francis, and I do, he's one of my heroes. Words like these create a certain type of religious ideal that's very pretty, like a dusty stained glass window. Might make you feel certain things, but it's not for the everyday. It's not for most of us. It's for saints. It's for special types. It's something that you can think about and go, oh, that is very beautiful. That's nice. Yeah, I should live a little bit more like that on Sunday. Or you can just say, yeah, it's this beautiful religious, thing that doesn't really apply. It's not really helpful to those of us leading in real life. And I think that attitude is not particularly helpful because A, I don't think it's what Jesus was talking about at all. And B, I don't think that's how Jesus approached spirituality. He did not ever want this kind of elitism, that this is for a select few, this is meant for only special few. I think what he's teaching, the blessedness, the presence of God, is meant for us all. We don't all take hold of this birthright. We don't all take hold of the opportunity, but it is available. It is not for a special, elite few who may happen to fit these descriptions of being very meek and mild and willing to get kicked by the world and by life. So let's look at kind of what is being talked about here and what I think is going to be a little bit more helpful. So when we begin our deconstruction, we got to start first with the word blessed, the blessed from the Beatitudes. So this word has kind of a strong background both in the kind of Greek-speaking world, the language the Bible is written in, as well as Jesus' own kind of Aramaic, Old Testament Hebrew thinking. From kind of the Greek philosophy aspect, the word was actually used almost exclusively of the gods, and it had kind of a connotation of contentedness or self-containedness. The Greek ideal, of course, being that what made the gods great is they were removed, they were separate from kind of the tragedy and the day-to-dayness of our lives. Which of course you can see why Jesus taking on flesh, coming, living among us, and being crucified would have been so offensive to kind of that type of separated spirituality. But the idea is kind of contentedness and separatedness from the circumstances of life. Probably more important was the religious background that Jesus would have inherited in the Old Testament, the Hebraic, the Jewish way of thinking. And in that thinking, blessedness was an expression of God's love. It tended to be in terms like having a big family, having the ability to provide for that big family, having land, having work to do. And then the idea of blessedness was, rather than thinking we deserve these things, we've earned these things, that they are in fact gifts and proofs that God loves us. And I think that though what the cultural ideal is changes over time, you can go all around the world, you can check all throughout history, the ideals have changed slightly from place to place, from culture to culture, from subculture to subculture. But the idea of blessedness, of fullness, of living the good life, it's never this list. It's never what we're going to be looking at in Jesus' expectation of blessedness. For us, it's probably, having the resources, the ability to get things done, right? Having enough influence, having enough money, having enough expertise. When a job needs doing, we're there where we can get it done. That's who we value. Those are the people we look up to. And I think ultimately behind that is we value freedom. We value getting to do whatever we want. That's, again, not who I think the Beatitudes are talking about. That's not who shows up, this cultural ideal of blessedness. So let's look at a few of these kind of ones. The first one is usually translated as like poor in spirit. That's a very literal translation. But Jesus picks a very specific word. The original Greek had several words for people who are poor. There's like the working poor. There's those who have some resources, but not much. But the word that is chosen here is that of an absolute beggar, an absolutely destitute person who starves if somebody else does not feed them or give them something. They've got nothing. They've got no resources. They bring nothing to the table. And that is saying the first person blessed is someone who looks like that spiritually. It's not usually who we think of as a blessed one or a person enjoying God's presence, because it's not just saying this is someone who's really poor, this is someone without resources, oh, they're so spiritual, they don't need any of that stuff. It's saying that about their very souls. This is a person who's destitute. They bring nothing to the table. There is probably no spiritual understanding. There's no real seeking after God. God's probably not even on this person's radar. They are spiritually destitute. They got nothing. And this kind of trend continues. Those who mourn, again, a very specific word is used. It's a mourner, someone who has lost someone who's had a tragedy happen to them. It's someone who, like, have you ever been at a funeral and there's that person who just can't get it together? Like, it's almost embarrassing. Like, you're like, yeah, I'm glad you feel this, but like, get it together. Stop. They're just sobbing uncontrollably, or they're just wailing, and you're just embarrassed for them. You're just like, come on, this is not really how we That's not really how we show sadness in this culture. They just can't get it together. And as we continue down the list, we're going to see kind of that for everything. It's an extreme example. It's a person who has nothing, who brings nothing. It's not what we traditionally think of as being blessed. It's not something that any of us want to be. And so if we look at this entire list, I think we're going to see kind of two big trends in all of them. This is someone who is absolutely at the end of their rope. They're absolutely resourceless, whether that's spiritually or emotionally, or in life circumstances. They're utterly lacking in peace and safety, and mercy, etc. Right? These are people that are starving in all these different areas, and these are all people who cannot deny kind of the hole or the emptiness that is there. They've got nothing to hide, they've got nothing to prove. It is just so obvious what is wrong and what is lacking in their world. So we tend to think of blessedness as fullness, right? As having enough, of having these good expressions, whereas Jesus here is saying the exact opposite. Those who lack, those who are utterly empty, those who are so obviously destitute in all these different ways, they are the ones that God is going to fill. They are the ones who can experience God's presence because they can't try to stick anything else into that emptiness. They can't put stuff there. They can't put prestige there. They can't put emotional stability there or whatever. They are obviously in great need of Him and His presence. And I think the Bible is very clear that that need can only be filled by the vastness, by the fullness of God Himself. And so the blessedness that's being talked here by these people these are losers. These are people that no one in the world wants to be or associate with. And they are the people who experience God because they need Him more than we are willing to admit to ourselves most of the time. So I want to read another translation of this list. It's a little less pretty. And here's what I want you to do. I want you to look for yourself in this list. Deep down inside, I think we all have holes. We all have an emptiness, a wound. Maybe it's in mourning and in sadness. Maybe it's feeling like we don't have enough. Maybe it's in one of these other areas. But I want you to try and find yourself on this list, because I think biblically we are all on here one way or another, whether we want to admit it to ourselves or not. So look for yourself in this little bit depressing list of the Beatitudes. How blissful the destitute, abject in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of the heavens. How blissful those who mourn, for they shall be aided. How blissful the gentle, for they shall inherit the earth. How blissful those who hunger and thirst for what's right, for they shall feast. How blissful the merciful, for they shall receive mercy. How blissful the pure in heart, for they shall see God. How blissful the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God. How blissful those who are persecuted for the sake of what is right, for theirs is the kingdom of the heavens. How blissful you, when they reproach you and persecute you and falsely accuse you of every evil for my sake. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward in the heavens is great, for thus they persecuted the prophets before you. And so I think the Beatitudes invite us into two very practical ways. One is, I think there's a lot of people looking for God right now. I think just based on circumstances, there's a lot of struggle. There's a lot of people who think of life situations less ideal. And I think a lot of us want to find God and know God's presence right now. Have you tried looking in that hole, in that emptiness you find within your own life? Have you tried letting God fill it? Have you tried looking in that deep, dark fear of what you can lose, or being found out, or that insecurity that you will never be lovable? Have you tried looking for God in that place that we don't even want to acknowledge is there within ourselves? that deepest, darkest fear, insecurity. Because I think the Beatitudes are telling us that is, in fact, where we will find God at times. Where we most need Him is where He's going to be. I think the other piece is not just within, but looking outward in society. Are we looking and expecting to find God among those people who may frighten us? Are we looking and expecting to find God among people that depress us or annoy us, who maybe aren't looking for God, who maybe aren't the ones we would think of as spiritual or religious or movers and shakers in any way, shape, or form? And if we have experienced that filling, if we have experienced this blessedness as he's talking about, God's presence, God's fullness in our places of darkness and of pain, is that in fact what we are announcing to the world, that God works in those places? Are we filling holes as God desires? Or are we nitpicking people's behavior? Are we wishing people were more like us so then they can be a good religious person? And then when they get cleaned up a little bit, then they can be part of the church. Then they can experience blessedness as we have. I think if we really want to be blessed and really want to experience God's presence, it does require acknowledging that deep emptiness in that hole, those dark places within our lives, and letting God fill them. And I think it is about extending what has been filled in us to others who need it so desperately, not telling them to change or be like us culturally, but filling real needs, because people are destitute. People are in mourning. People are in need of mercy. People are in need of peace. We can't give those things ourselves, but God can. He can fill any hole in our life, in our society, in our world. Is that what we're in fact doing? Pouring from the goodness and the grace, the blessedness we have experienced? Are we pouring that into the empty places in people's lives and in the world? Or are we doing something else? Because I think that's the problem with the way the Beatitudes are approached most of the time. They're empty, they're pretty, but they're not particularly useful. That's not remotely what God is up to in experiencing blessedness and enjoying his presence. He fills those places of darkness, those places of emptiness, and he expects us to take him and allow him to fill those places in the world and in other people's lives. So look at the Beatitudes this week. Enjoy them. Let your personal ache and insecurity and pain be filled, because that can be and it should be the presence of God. That is your right, and it is your privilege as a beloved child of God to enjoy that blessedness in a fuller, deeper, and more real way than what the world usually tells us being blessed is.